I'd like to thank everyone for coming out today. This is a great crowd. We really appreciate it. This is a really significant event for Lake Wales. And before we really get started, I want to invite David Price, the president of Buck Tower Gardens, who's our host today. Thank you, David. Please stand up and give us a little greeting.
Thank you all. We're really happy to host the city's Envisioned program here at Buck Tower Gardens. It's really fitting that we should be talking about visioning for Lake Wales here. Edward Bach was a real big proponent of building good communities and good home design too. In fact, he built the garden. His number one reason for building the garden was for people to come here and be inspired and go back to their communities and make their communities better. So we're happy to be a part of this, and we thank Victor Dover and his staff for all that they're bringing to the table. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, David. And now, before we get rolling, I'd like to also recognize some of the VIPs in the room. We have Mayor Jack Hilligoss is present. Deputy Mayor Robin Gibson is here. Commissioner Terry Howell, thank you for coming. And Commissioner Danny Kruger is here. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. And also, I understand James Slayton, our city manager, is here as well. Thank you, James, for being here. And I'd also like to thank the sponsors and co-sponsors of this event, because these are the people who helped make it all happen. Yes. Okay, there he is, just arrived. Daniel Williams is here. Welcome. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this session, initial session really, of Lake Wales Envisioned. I'm Robert Connors. I'm the president of Lake Wales Heritage, which is a 4-year-old civic group, and we're proud to be one of the sponsors of this event. I'm also an author and historian, so I want to give you a little perspective of time before we get started, because Lake Wales was conceived by its 4 very imaginative founders as a resort city in 1911. It wasn't just another town, it was going to be a resort. And it was planned as a city in a garden, a retreat set around broad parks on the shores of beautiful lakes, surrounded by forests of longleaf pine and citrus groves. 2 years later, the community of Mountain Lake was begun, and that marked the arrival of Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. At the time, he was the world's most famous landscape architect, and he designed not only those grounds in Mountain Lake, but scores of home sites there. And for those who may not be aware of the history of Olmsted, he had followed in the footsteps of his equally famous father, who had designed parks in many major cities across the United States, as well as the grounds of the US Capitol, the Niagara Reserve, Montreal's Mount Royal Park, Boston's Emerald Necklace of parks, more than 100 colleges and university campuses from Harvard to Stanford. So Olmsted was his father's acolyte. And like him, he excelled at creating these beautiful landscapes. When Edward Bach built a home here a short time later, he hired Olmsted, like many did, to landscape his own grounds. And then he fell in love with Iron Mountain and hired him to landscape the entire park that we're in now, then known as the Mountain Lake Sanctuary, today's Buck Tower Gardens. And when that work was done in 1929, Bach still was not satisfied. So he secretly hired Olmsted to create a landscape plan for the entire city of Lake Wales. And so when that work was begun in 1930, but then unfortunately Bach died and the Great Depression struck. But the planting of trees and shrubs had begun in earnest in 1930, and that was an effort to complete the founders' original intention of a fully realized garden city. And because of that effort, Lake Wales earned its moniker of the crown jewel of the ridge. So for decades, that reputation was sustained through the efforts of a variety of dedicated garden clubs and the work of a Lake Wales City Parks director named Monk Griffin. So there were flowers throughout the city for many years, but it was a very proud history, but in the 70s it began to decline. Mr. Griffin retired and the parks and garden clubs generally dissolved. So now today, Lake Wales Heritage has taken on this enormous task of replanting what will eventually amount to thousands of trees and shrubs all across the city in accordance with the original designs created by Olmsted in 1929-30. So there's dozens of trees already in the ground, but it's an effort that will take years to accomplish. But today we start a project that is much broader, and the scope of our challenges have grown apace with the city. And each of us in this room must be a part of the solution. Now I'm going to go back deeper into history. In 1675, Sir Isaac Newton wrote that, "If I have seen further, it is by standing upon the shoulders of giants." So this process that will give us a chance to see farther, we can plan for the future of the community, but our success will be dependent upon us as a community, because there's a significant difference between a place like Lake Wales and the community that inhabits it. Places are static, dots on a map. Communities are made up of people, and they constantly evolve and change. People move away or they pass on, even as new arrivals come to fill their places. So our community today has very little in common with the community of 50 years ago. Those of us who remember that time are very few. But now it falls upon us in this room to provide the leadership for our times. Let's not fail. Today we begin a process that may lead us to recapture the reputation, the quality of life that made Lake Wales the crown jewel of the Ridge. Today and during the coming weeks and months, each of us will have an opportunity to absorb new information, process new ideas, and devise new strategies. Thanks to the outstanding team of professionals and experts who will focus their attentions on Lake Wales, we are now granted the rare privilege of a look deep into the future. The choice will be ours. Let us stand upon the shoulders of giants. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Victor Dover. I'm a town planner and urban designer. Our firm is Dover Cole and Partners, and we have the privilege of getting to help a lot of communities around the country stop, pause, think, and decide what they want to be when they grow up. And yes, many of them are already 100 years old, or more than 100 years old when they start having that conversation. This afternoon, we're doing something special. Before we start that emotionally charged and complicated and technical process I talked about, we want to pause and lift our eyes up above the horizon and think about the big picture. What could be? Like, what is really your vision for this place? And how does it compare to the best that you could possibly be? And so we begin a process like this when we always like to bring people together and take a look at those big questions and ask some people who aren't from around here to share with us what they're doing, where they live, and what they've learned along the way that we might be able to incorporate, not in reinventing the wheel, learning from them. So in the first session, I'll begin it and we'll talk about neighborhood design, basically. And to make it bigger than that, Wade Walker will follow me. He's a transportation engineer, and he'll speak about a livable transportation network. Great traditional neighborhoods, one of the main aspirations of Lake Wales Envisioned. A livable transportation network, another one. So we'll start with that. You'll also hear from Jonathan Paul, who was the author of the city's mobility plan, and he'll give a recap on that. Many of us could use a refresher. Some have never heard about it. And Jonathan, this is your big chance to tell a whole lot of Lake Wales what you've been working on. In the second session, we're going to hear from a couple of developers. Both of them practicing urban designers and developers who can share with us their experiences. You'll hear from Vince Graham, who's visiting us from Charleston, has done projects in Charleston that are astonishingly beautiful and yet profitable and economically sensible for both the investors, the people who have come to be owners of property within them, and for their host communities. So we'll be asking him about that. Marcella Camblor-Koutsoumanis will follow. She's from over in the Stewart area, and Marcella's going to tell us about the experiences that they're having in St. Lucie County and Martin County on just the same sort of issues that today confront Greater Lake Wales. In the third session, we're going to hear from Dr. Jay Exum, who's an ecologist and a specialist on the unique ecosystem and biology of the ridge. And he's going to talk to us about the Big Green Network. And to bring it all together, we'll hear from Steve Nygren, who's the developer of a unique community that balances real estate development and conservation in a powerful way. That's Steve Nygren, who's going to tell us about Serenbe, which is in Georgia. At the end of all of that, we'll have some time for questions in each session. But at the end of all of that, we're going to ask a few people to give us some gut responses to what they heard through the day. Skip Alford from the Chamber of Commerce. Thank you, Skip, for being willing to do that. The chair of the Community Redevelopment Agency, Robin Gibson, has volunteered to offer some thoughts. We'll hear from Paul Owens. Paul, there you are. Paul is the president of Thousand Friends of Florida, which deserves a round of applause for agreeing to be co-sponsors of this effort. Thank you, Paul. When that is over around 5 o'clock, maybe a little thereafter, we have a reception in the lobby for all of you, so you won't go thirsty or hungry. That's been sponsored by Wales Point Restaurant and Bar in downtown Lake Wales and Lake Wales News. So Tiffany Davis and Robert Connors, thank you all for that sponsorship. Let's give them a thanks for that. Yeah, thank you. Now we'll say that even then, it won't be over. Like the old infomercial salesman used to say, but wait, there's more. After that reception, we're going to come back together and have the kickoff community meeting. And for citizens of Lake Wales who are coming to the community meeting, Bach Tower, and to this symposium, Bach Tower has made admission free for everyone who's coming to participate in this, and they'll have an opportunity to both see the gardens at no charge and participate in our community kickoff. We're not sure if we will have an equally challenging seating situation. Look at the standing room only crowd. Give yourselves a round of applause for signing up for just spending your afternoon with us. And just so you all can help us spread the word, if we do need to, we'll do 2 seatings, one at 6:30 and one at 7:30 for that community meeting. So anybody that doesn't make it in the room in the first round can have a little time to visit the garden and then come back in at 7:30 and we'll get them then. Now, a lot will go on over the next few months with this project, including, for those of you who've been to the Lake Wales Envisioned website, you've seen some of this. We have a webinar on March 29th. Our friend and colleague Joe Minicozy, who's an economist. Joe Minicozy is very interesting because he has found ways to look and help people visualize the economic impact of one kind of development or another. So as you're making choices about what belongs on this acre or that acre, or what to do in downtown and its close-in neighborhoods in the core, what to do in the hinterlands, I think Joe's advice is going to be very welcome. And he's traveled all over the country building very vivid maps and diagrams and things that show in a visual way what's happening in the economics of real estate and land use. So that'll be a webinar, so you can watch it from the comfort of your home. If you haven't ever heard Joe speak, you should listen to that. It will also be recorded, like today's sessions, and we'll put those on the website so people that didn't make it here today or aren't able to watch Joe live and send him questions live, they'll be able to see it after the fact. So that's on March 29th at 6 o'clock. Now, my friend and colleague, Dr. Bruce Stevenson from Rollins College, another of our sponsors in Lake Wales Envisioned, gave a lecture from this exact spot just a few weeks ago to talk about the connections between Olmsted and Lake Wales and Olmsted Jr.'s best student, John Nolan, the first American to call himself a professional city planner. Sean, thank you for attending that. The planners thought that was really great nerdy stuff. In fact, we thought it was so good that we had Bruce re-record it with a better audio track. And just this morning, it went live on lakewalesenvision.com and the YouTube channel. So anybody who missed that can now go see what Bruce had to say about that work. So an academic interest, yes, but I think, Bruce, what was great about that talk was you made the Olmsted and Nolan stories relevant for today and today's problems. So thank you for doing that. So on to livable community design. I'll start it off. Here's a radical idea. Human beings have been coming together for about 6,000 years in towns, our natural human habitat, villages, towns, and cities, for all sorts of reasons. We come together for commerce. We come together for division of labor. We come together for our collective security. But perhaps most of all, because we're social beings. We're drawn to the places that other people also want to be. If you've wondered, like, why is that downtown, that main street doing so great with all the lights on and the restaurants and people having a good time and everybody's around? They worked to make it a place where people wanted to be. And that's a phenomenon you can see on display in, say, downtown Winter Park or downtown Winter Garden or downtown Winter Haven or any of those winters. And we can do that in downtown Lake Wales. In fact, it's in the works. But in each of these kinds of settings, whether it's a small, idyllic countryside village or a big, bustling city, the spaces outside our buildings, outside our homes, outside our workplaces, the spaces between the buildings are the keys to the sense of place. Now, we call it the public realm. That public realm has a close-up dimension. It's the street or square just beyond your home or your garden. And it has a big picture dimension, the way the settlement fits into the larger countryside. In our practice, working about half the time for local governments and community groups and about half the time for private developers and investors, not in the same place at the same time, we're often asked to help communities figure this out. They're usually grappling with some problems that might sound familiar. Changing local economies, changing industry, population growth, and a sense of peril for their scenic backdrop. That's a very common theme. And inevitably, they have to design their way out of these problems. Now, Lake Wales has one of those traditional, potent town forms. And I believe it's undergoing a reawakening just in time, actually. The lights are turning back on in the historic downtown. It's an example, I pointed this out a couple of years ago, what Wilson Quarterly once called the second coming of the great American small town. Watch downtown Lake Wales and the Northwest neighborhood over the next 5 years. So that's happened here, just like it had happened in all those other towns for thousands of years. But the shapers of Lake Wales that everyone loves had something else. They had this deep respect for the idea of town and country. And they carried out community design in a way that required starting with the green parts. And we were reminded of that every time we go out into the long views and vistas. Yes, that little speck at the top of the picture is Bok Tower on the horizon. Their realization was that the ridge presented this unique chance. It was during a period when Florida was called by Nolan and others the great laboratory of town and city building. And they had this unique chance to showcase a kind of reconciliation of town and countryside, and in particular, bringing green into the city. So that's where they began to visualize a city in a garden, rising on the ridge, as if from the Garden of Eden. And it was even before Olmsted. Even before Olmsted Brothers arrived, the original surveyors and planners of the town infused the city plan with this big commitment to public space. In fact, vast amounts of public space around Crystal Lake and Lake Wales are the examples of that. The sheer generosity of this is astonishing. They're vast. And they were set up for the enjoyment of everybody. They're not gated off or privatized. The sheer quantity of public space that was kind of baked into the early settlement is far greater than any peer municipality I can name in our state. I can't name any one that is close. And this is your inheritance. They knew what's outside matters, that you couldn't just measure real estate or zoning by the number of square feet or the number of acres or homes per acre or the number of parking spaces. And as the town evolved, and now with the help of the Olmsted Brothers and other talented landscape architects, these spaces were graced with the beautiful oaks and the trails and the town clock and the streets, things that we all take for granted. But you have to remember, someone drew these things. They drew lines on a map. Someone installed these things. They had to dig the hole for that oak and plant it there, knowing that it would take time for it to grow. And in a way, if we can bring that long-term sort of thinking into the room will have a better plan at the end of Lake Wales Envisioned. Now, this city in a garden was juxtaposed against its own unique, I think, breathtaking scenic backdrop, in part provided by the scenic citrus groves on the rolling hills, and also in the lowlands by the lakes and the waterways between the lakes, and in the bigger picture, Tiger Creek and the Kissimmee River. So, Florida, or, Florida. So fast forward a little bit into the middle and late 20th century, when we began this process of coating the state in asphalt. Now that's not Polk County, to be fair. That's another place to the north. But all over our country, in fact, we began transforming the continent we had inherited and those places that all those folks worked on into something else. And we, as a people, began to lose our confidence in the ideas of growth and change. But think, every place you go visit on vacation because it's lovely to be there, whether it's Charleston or Savannah or Key West or Europe, exists in that way that you love it because a developer, an investor, put one brick on top of another or nailed two sticks together and started building it up and making it more complete. And so growth and change, we used to believe, could routinely make things better rather than worse. And if we have one big challenge, Mr. Mayor, commissioners, before us in Lake Wales Envisioned, it's to restore that confidence that we can have growth and change and still like it just as much or even more than we liked it before. Now, it's worth looking at some maps because, planning, we have to look at maps. This is a map of the city's development footprint. It, of course, extends fairly far beyond the city limits at the time in 1941. And here's the same map in 1964 and in 1980 and in 2002 and in 2022. So just to put them on the screen side by side, in 1964, we had about 4¼ square miles of area inside the development footprint. And now, including some sites that are in the city or annexed or zoned, not quite yet developed, we have close to 19 square miles. And against that canvas, we have new pressures from the outside. You may have noticed in the New York Times in the last couple of months that the Lakeland Winter Haven Metropolitan Statistical Area, of which Lake Wales is part, rose right to the top of the national chart for the places that had the most dramatic change between the Great Recession and now in terms of the difference between supply and demand for housing. 10 years earlier, or 11 years ago, this area had 3.3% more homes than it had buyers or renters for. So we were in surplus. And you all remember Econ 101 from freshman year. The law of supply and demand says that when you have surplus, prices go down or they stay the same. Fast forward to a couple of years ago, even before the latest statistics with COVID, and that number had switched to almost 8% under the demand. So there's been people we know were coming to Florida, and now post-pandemic, more of them are coming to Florida, and a lot of them want to be here. So there's a lot of pressure. Let's add to the backdrop that scenery that I described in the rolling citrus groves is seriously in trouble. Orange production in the United States and in Florida in particular has been descending downward for a quarter century, but has fallen off a cliff in recent years thanks to citrus's own pandemic. The citrus greening, you all know about it, but that arc shows how rapidly the production has dropped since the beginning of the citrus greening problem. And so your neighbors who have been owning property in this place for 100 years or more, using it year after year for citrus, that juggernaut, iconic industry, are left with few choices. They have to figure out new ways to use this land, or at least some of it, while they wait for solutions, if they come, to the medical problem in their plants. Now let's look at that on a map. Lake Wales incorporated limits are shown in the orange in the center here. And then you see this sort of tan or pale yellow color going around it. Let me just simplify the map. That's the city's utilities service area. So in that area, will be decisions to be made over the next 100 years about how and when and where the city will provide water and sewer service inside that area. And so we have to come together as a community and decide how that should happen and how it can be done in a way that is fair and balanced for all, so that you can see change happen and feel proud of it, like it was worthy of Lake Wales. That's why the city commissions set this process in motion. Now, they adopted 8 simply worded aspirations that are set up as the initial Bill of Rights or Continental Congress kind of document for this project. And I'm sure this will evolve as we work together and confirm things, refine them. And these are all found on the Lake Wales Envisioned website. But I want to talk now about number 6, because there's a lot of interest in this one, and it should help us get our work done. Number 6 says, we will seek, it's a mouthful, sorry for the run-on sentence. We will seek to make traditional neighborhoods with walkable, connected streets that create a high-quality public realm the norm, not the exception to the rule or something we hope for but can't really be sure about, the norm. So what do we mean when we say walkable, connected, traditional neighborhoods? Well, as my old cartoon shows, we probably don't mean this. We probably don't mean a collection of land uses that are just arrayed on the land. This parcel for commercial, that parcel for houses, this other parcel for housing, this parcel for industrial. We probably mean something that has more design to it. And as a result of that design, might be thicker with development, might accommodate more population growth, more economic exchanges and value. We probably don't mean this, where one parcel at a time turns into random sprawl. And since that's the dimensions of the property, that's how much of the property gets filled up with as many houses as you can fix. Zooming out, we probably don't mean this. Now, I want you to remember this photograph when Wade speaks in a minute, because you're going to see a diagram that kind of explains why this, a kind of archetypal Central Florida sprawl, is a problem. I'm describing a backdrop against which we work. And in our time, we don't just have declining agriculture. We have a whole series of issues. When the packing house closed, 70 jobs went away. If you look at the economic reports, many people in Greater Lake Wales are still earning less than they should, and the rents they can afford to pay are not enough to justify new construction. So this is an issue. So household incomes are still a concerning issue. And then we have simultaneous epidemics of childhood obesity, early onset diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, a lot of them coming about as a result of the fact that as Americans, we don't walk as much as we should. Keep going down the list. Choke the planet on your emissions, lose your historic rural backdrop, watch the environment degrade, feel the loneliness. That is a national problem. This is a long list, right? These are not the only ones that concern me. I am also concerned about this one. This is an old cartoon from Forbes. It's America. We're so divided, right? We don't know what it is yet, but we're already against it. We're just... So I'm going to ask you, if your instinct is to think like these guys and be sure no matter what it is, I'm against it because it's not the way we always did it, try to suspend that for the next few weeks and months as we work on Lake Wales Envisioned. Because we might have to do things a little differently than the way we always did it. We might have to be creative about the ways of using land. Some of the creativity can do things like let us learn to build things closer together without hating them. And in the process, take some of the pressure off the rural lands on the edge. If we could learn to build those compact, traditional communities where things are by design a little closer together, we won't need as much land to accommodate the population growth. And we might get some other benefits. So what does a traditional neighborhood look like? Well, in diagram, there are a few things we can show you that summarize it. One is it doesn't go on across the horizon forever. It is usually a limited size, walkable size, say rough rule of thumb, quarter mile or 5 minutes walk from center to edge. If there's a bigger property than that, it can be designed as multiple neighborhoods. This traditional neighborhood has an integrated network of walkable streets. Things connect on purpose. It's actually set up so that you could walk from here to there for pleasure or for purpose. This traditional neighborhood has a mix of housing types and land uses within the neighborhood. So not everybody buys exactly the same house and fits exactly the same buyer profile. You might actually have a neighborhood where someone could grow up, come back, raise a family, and retire without having to leave their friends and their family and their congregation. The traditional neighborhoods have special sites set aside for civic purposes, like the town square or the park, like those generous public spaces around the lakes that I described before. Special sites for civic buildings where they're given symbolic importance. And what typically these traditional neighborhoods have an identifiable center and edge. You know when you've arrived at the heart of it, you know when you've arrived at the edge of it. And this is always reinforced. For example, when we look across a wide open space at the town, we see the fronts of buildings. When we stand in front of one building, we see the front of its companion building across the street, not the backs of buildings facing public space. So I just want to compare a couple of slides. Say, take a look at this street that happens to be in the low country of South Carolina. But as you see, simple front porch houses, those could be Florida, those could be a lot of places. Now let's compare that to this scene. All right, so we can all immediately spot the differences, right? Where would you prefer to live? Show of hands. I'm only kidding. But the bad news here is that in the crude, blunt instrument sorts of planning tools that we use for the legal side of planning, zoning and comprehensive plans, these are exactly the same. They have the same land use, the single family residential detached, the same density, that's the number of dwelling units per acre. These lots are about the same size, the same amount of parking and so on. So of course there are some big differences. This one happens to be Haines City. We just love to pick on Haines City when we're in Lake Woods. The big difference is that they built this neighborhood after we began to enshrine on the fronts of the houses our devotion to life on four wheels. And this one has the front porches in conversation distance of the sidewalk. So driving around Lake Wales or putting the drone up and looking down on Lake Wales, you see a lot of these scenes. So change is underway. Everything you might have read about in the paper may not occur because people start projects and don't always finish them. Many things are proposed, only some are done. But just the projects that are underway are substantial in number. And on top of the changes in greenfield sites, we have the aging commercial scenes. The mall, the shopping centers, the Orange Grove Shopping Center where Walmart used to be, and so on, are all aging, and some not so gracefully. And we're going to be all asked as a community to think about those lands differently. In the future, how might we reconfigure them so that they engender more loyalty among customers and find more economic reasons for being? I actually love the land bank you've established along Highway 60 and Highway 27 with all the graying out shopping centers, because you will find room to build to accommodate your population if you look closely. A lot of those, this is an old Kmart for reference. Remember Kmart? Remember Sears? Remember Circuit City and Linens and Things and Sports Authority? And I'll stop. So one of the things that we've noticed, and that's not just unique to here, it happens all over the country, is this issue of understanding the building to street relationship and getting things right, like the fronts and backs of buildings. So we know we have to meet certain technical requirements. We have to get the radius at the intersection to accommodate the fire truck and the moving van. And we have to get the retention areas to store the right amount of stormwater in the 100-year storm, and so forth and so on. But if you forget the technical requirement about those building to street relationships, that street that might otherwise have been walkable, and again, I'm using Haines City just to illustrate the point, even one with street trees in this case, and sidewalks, is one where your walk is from one driveway to the next, and every 40 feet or so, you have 20 or 22 feet of garage door out of every 40 feet on those lots. So that doesn't make for a great experience. No wonder people are concerned when they're used to seeing it in agriculture, and then they see it turn to subdivision, one last harvest, because it feels like a trade down. Isn't it possible to envision development that hits a higher standard so that it feels like a trade up, or at least an even trade, so that when you go there and you stand in its streets, you do see the fronts of buildings instead of the backs. This mysterious Hollywood vision of science fiction simulation of a traditional neighborhood isn't any of those things. It's a real thing. It's actually built. That's Baldwin Park. It's not far from here. You can go take a look at it. Real life, flesh and blood investors and developers and their architects and engineers built it that way in recent memory. So we know it can be done. Now you might have noticed that the houses with the front porches on the front instead of the garage doors don't have all those driveways. And so one of the techniques is to have an alley. This is the alley in Baldwin Park that supports the kind of development I just showed you. Not so bad, right? We hear the word alleyway or alley and it conjures visions of something bad. Not too bad, actually. Pretty wonderful place. So in a great traditional neighborhood, you might have spots unlocked by that kind of design convention where the buildings are rather close together, and other spots where the buildings are quite far apart. So in a neighborhood like this one, we can have traditional, modestly sized, single-family detached houses, front porches, and that conversation distance of the sidewalk, and then a block or two away have room for the big estate lots. Building compactly in part of it means we have room to be more flexible and have more elbow room in the other parts, whether we want to make it for a lottery winner or a public park. Last comment is about variety. In traditional American neighborhoods, you can always find houses that are close together that aren't all the same size or price. And this one, there's a house in the middle of the picture, which is a beautiful and dignified sort of standard house. To its right is one with elaborate fancy architecture and more brick and more square footage. And to its left, a tiny cottage where a senior citizen lives. And that was normal. For basically from colonial times until the 1940s, that was the normal way to build neighborhoods. A lot of times we call these things like that little cottage part of the missing middle. Not quite a condo on a big apartment complex and not quite a single family detached house, but something in between. And there are a lot of those. These new traditional neighborhoods are good at accommodating that missing middle of housing types, which makes housing an option for a lot more people at a price they can afford. Sometimes it's just allowing for shallow setbacks and narrow lots. You can reduce the per unit land cost and make it available to a lot more people. Or the cottages that I showed you a moment ago. Or townhouses that are semi-attached and close together. Or row houses that are actually attached to each other and live-work combinations. Well, let's keep going up. What about courtyard apartment buildings? Does this seem at all familiar? Those who love downtown Lake Wales, you recognize it as the building type we see at the Court of the Seven Chimneys on Park Avenue. So you've been doing this missing middle stuff historically, just not lately. Or what about this one? This is a so-called mansion apartment. That's a house just like the houses next to it, except it has 4 or 6 or 8 dwelling units in it. The world didn't come to an end. And we can keep going. This menu of housing types is so big and rich with traditional neighborhoods. Bungalow courts, accessory dwellings, sometimes called granny flats or in-wall quarters, garage apartments. That's the garage apartment where Fonzie lived in Happy Days. For the ones who are old enough to remember that. You got to have some place for the Fonz. And pocket neighborhoods are another possibility. So we've got to get creative if we're going to live closer together and love it more by design. The rewards for doing so are pretty vast. The new traditional neighborhoods have paid off for the people who invested in them and for the people who bought the houses and watched them appreciate. Like, look at this interesting street where there's no asphalt. Once again, brought to you by the alley on the other side. Or this street where Wade used to live in the St. Albans neighborhood in Davidson, North Carolina. A senior lady here I caught walking on her daily walk, and I asked her about this street, and she pointed to the street trees at her left, and she said, "These are my lifeline. Because of them, I get outside and get my daily exercise." Live-work combinations, when they brought that to Glenwood Park in Georgia, it was immediately snapped up because they tapped into decades of unmet demand, pent-up demand. And it wasn't the only thing they did. They also built big public park space, the things that are unlocked by being creative and designing this decision to live closer together in community. You'll hear from Vince Graham today, who was the developer impresario behind that street in a neighborhood called Ion, across the river from Charleston and Mount Pleasant. And he was also the developer of a neighborhood called New Point. And as a result of his big risk-taking and doing this radical, experimental, traditional neighborhood design, in other words, not inventing it, but following the lessons of the old places, he found himself on the cover of the Wall Street Journal for the business decision in doing that. And when you hear from Joe Minicozy, I'm sure that he'll talk about what that meant for the tax base. These spikes represent property value. So you get more sales tax or more property tax, because you brought things close together by design. This is the way we used to do it. Then we began spreading things apart. So I'm hopeful that we'll actually learn how to generate good returns for your landowners when they do have to build, and economically sensible projects for the developers when you do have to build, without using all of your land to do it. Well, that's your challenge. The question is, what's your vision for the future of Lake Wales? Thank you very much. We started a little late and I ran a little long, so I'm going to rush you guys, but we're okay. This is Wade Walker, transportation engineer. He's going to tell us about mobility best practices.
Thank you, Victor. So good to see so many people here. And in addition to being a transportation engineer, I'm also a little bit of an urban planning and landscape architecture nerd. I absolutely love this place. Living in Orlando here quite often. My family, we are members of the garden, so we'll actually be back down here Friday night. And any of you that have not seen the Steep Canyon Rangers, I highly recommend it. From living in North Carolina for several years, like Victor said, I do live in Orlando now. But one of the things that we saw a lot of the great land planning and design aspects, but then all we have to do is go right out to Highway 27. It's like, okay, well, how do we get around? Because we know that as development occurs, typically you start to see more traffic. Now, what we want to be looking at is how does the transportation and the land use work together in the kind of scenario that Victor was talking about. And to do that, we really kind of have to look at what has gone wrong before. And really that goes back to what we do in our traditional planning process. From a transportation engineering perspective, one of the things that we would do, we would look at these long-range plans. For land use, we would kind of anticipate what was going to happen, much in the same forms of that stripped single-use commercial residential that we would see on corridors such as 27. We would then forecast how much traffic that's going to cause, and then put it on that road and say, oh my gosh, we've got way too much traffic on this road. We need to widen it. And that's really the way that we've done transportation planning for many, many years. And a lot of it really is precipitated by the way that we've grown. And historically, the way that a lot of this part of the country has grown, especially in the South and Central Florida in particular, is we have these great small towns, much like Lake Wales. And then we have agricultural, surrounded by agricultural farmland. until such time as something happens that starts to change the character of that, and that land starts to flip and becomes things. It gets sold and rezoned, and then gets converted to residential development. So now we've got a little bit of a disconnect. You see, they've got the historic town here on the lower part of the screen, and then we've got houses. And what are they going to want to do? They're going to want to get from their houses to what's going on over here. So as that happens, we look at it and we say, oh my goodness, we need more road here. And so the road gets widened, much like 27 did at some point. And then as that starts to happen, it opens a great new front door for commercial development that is very much in an auto-oriented kind of context. And it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy that as we build it, they come. As we build it, they come. As we build it, they come. And we may end up having to continually widen that road until we just can't do it anymore. So there are other ways to do that. Like I said, what we started to do was we really looked at accommodating the car instead of the person for many, many years. And now we're considering other things. So the way that we're starting to look at transportation is we're starting with that first. And we're looking at, it's not just about the car, but it's about all the ways that we can move around. We can look at those multimodal improvements, which helps us manage travel and then starts to dictate some of the land use decisions that we make. So if we make a decision that, my mentor in the practice said, one of the first questions he would ask is, what's the most road we can have here? And what do you want? And then that starts to dictate where you can go from there as well. Where this starts to manifest itself is when you start to look at the way that we've kind of historically done development on this top piece along some of our more rural corridors as we grow. Looking at them in that suburban auto-oriented pattern, everything is segregated. Everything is isolated, all the different uses. You have the yellow in the residential, the purple with being the schools, parks, and then the red in commercial. But as you start to put that into a more mixed use and a pattern, same amount of development on the north and the south, but you can see it's a little more compact and it's served by a grid network of streets, which starts to play itself out with how do you get from point A to point B? And so if you're in a development pattern along, and the important part is that road down the center is the same. It stays the same. And so one of the things you can do with those uses that are apart from each other and isolated, it ends up putting pretty much every trip that you have to make on that road. Whereas you see in the lower part of the screen, in that alternate pattern, you have other ways of getting around. And the way that starts to manifest itself is every single trip that has to be made on that road is on top of each other and starts to cause congestion.
Wait a minute.
Yes.
Wade just explained why this much growth and development or economic progress generates that much traffic congestion. If you've ever wondered your whole life why that is the case, he just explained it.
Oh, well, thank you. But thank you. I appreciate that. Anyway, one of the things that I really do start to look at is, so what does that center street really have to look like in both those patterns? So the slide series I showed previously, you have to widen that road to accommodate. In that other pattern, it doesn't have to be done that way. So it can actually be, that space can be repurposed for other things. And what we really need to be doing is designing in context for all users and really flipping the script. So we want to make sure that we're creating streets for the right users and for the right context. So for the right kind of land use that's along there. And Florida FDOT has really come along with this and has created this context classification guide where they take an urban design principle called the transect that moves from a more natural through a rural, through small town, into more of the suburban and then the highly urban areas, and really looks at all those different contexts and starts to define what can be done on a road because of that, one of the things that this does is it allows FDOT to say yes in a lot of places where they used to have to say no. It's tied to their design standards and all of those different things that we can actually create more livable streets. The interesting point about this also is that there's an understanding that that context, what may have a certain context today, can shift and it can become something different. So as a place grows, it can become something different, and then the road character responds to that as well. If you were all part of Lake Wales Connected, you probably heard this idea of complete streets and why those are important. Well, there's several reasons that those are important. One being, a lot of us, myself included, are getting older. I do not want to drive nearly as much as I used to. Whenever I was my son's age, I wanted to drive all the time. Not so much anymore. But I want to be able to get those uses. I don't want to have to get in the car every time that I need anything or want to go visit anyone. So it's not an old principle. But the other thing that kind of pattern will do is it can magically make trips disappear. So right now, my traffic engineering training tells me that if I have 3 different destinations, that I'm generating 6 vehicle trips for that. But if I put that mix of uses close together and I can start to satisfy those trips, otherwise I can reduce that number of trips, and you can see that maybe I can walk, maybe I can ride a bike, maybe I can take an e-bike or a one-wheel, which I have not necessarily done. But we do see we do see the e-bike revolution has really helped improve accessibility. Other thing about complete streets that is really, really critical is that, speed kills. There's metrics out there that says, if you're struck by a vehicle going 20 miles an hour, it's about a 5% chance that you're going to die, but it's not a linear relationship. If that speed doubles, your survival rate goes down to about 20%. So when we do this and we're creating places that, like Victor said, that are walkable, the speed is a real issue. Because quite frankly, we've had a real problem in Florida. This is not the graph that you want to be number one on, is the way that we historically have performed with vehicle fatalities. And it's really bad on the pedestrian and bicycle side. But that's one of the reasons that FDOT has implemented what they call Target Zero, and really looking at these different measures and safety measures to accommodate multimodal within those context zones where we are expecting people to be walking and biking based on the land use. So a few factors for creating walkable places. You see kind of this top 10 list. Engineers are all about lists, as we are with numbers. But some of the things that are the bottom part of the list, 1 through 4, starts to fall under what Victor was talking about with the site design. The top piece is with your transportation planning and engineering, but in the middle is this piece that can really be looked at from complete streets. So things like adding on-street parking, adding street trees, adding sidewalks, making those streets narrow. Florida Department of Transportation calls it speed management. All of these different characteristics that can cause people to slow down in their vehicle, but also have facilities where you feel safe and comfortable biking and walking. Because really, these shorter trips are great for walking and biking. And again, if you start to throw things like e-bikes into the mix, you can really start to amp that up even more as well. 50% of household trips are less than 3 miles. Over a quarter are less than 1 mile, and all of those can be accommodated by a bike, e-bike, and then we want to make sure that we have the facilities to be able to do that. When we have the facilities, we want to build it for Isabella. We want to build it for 8 to 80. We want to be able to have facilities for everybody that they can do these kinds of things, and that you actually do have the option of and feeling safe and comfortable walking and biking to do that. From a bike facility standpoint, there's a lot of different ways you can mix and match that pavement. You can do everything from off-street shared use paths, which can happen on facilities like US 27, like State Road 60. You get people separated off of the pavement. away from the travel lanes, even with side paths or separated bike lanes. Then on other streets, maybe you look at buffering the bike lanes, providing some kind of separation. And then as the speeds go down and those streets get narrower into more of a residential context and a local street context, maybe even being able to just do the shared lanes because of the speed differential and lower amount of traffic. Final thought, complete streets. They're not just for downtowns. If you start to take into account context and what else can be done, and really embrace the fact that streets can be complete, different degrees of completeness depending on the context, and that we want things to be safe as well. So lots of different ways within an area like this to accommodate things like walking and biking. In some cases, this is along a 50-mile-an-hour roadway outside of in northern Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, outside of Charlotte, suburban area of Charlotte. You can see the trail off to the side of the 2-lane rural road. You can also see, we're also seeing things like separated bike lanes within smaller towns and just in areas. This is Russellville, Arkansas, population about 12,000. This connects a university to downtown, and you see the separated bike lanes along this connector road. Utility easements are a great place to locate trails. And so one of the things that we would want to look at is, where can we do this? Where are there power lines that we can, are there power line easements that we can go along, or waterways? You can see back behind the covered bridge, a trail also in the stream bed area as well. And also along railroads. So this is a rail width trail in Northwest Arkansas, but you guys don't need to really know about this along with the repurposed railroads, because you've got one right here in Lake Wales. I'm actually looking forward to riding this trail as well. And then also this idea of where the intersections come together. How can you do that are more consistent with that are safer and more consistent with more of the rural landscapes? You can do this with roundabouts. And this one is actually the intersection of 2 U.S. highways in Northern Virginia, Loudoun County, Northern Virginia. Is that sand? We will say that's sand since it's the first day of spring. So yeah, happy spring. I hear it's going to last 3 days here this year. So. And then when you start to bring it all together and with the land use, this is actually about a 3-year-old development outside of the town of Davidson, North Carolina, north of Charlotte. And you can see, this is kind of what Victor was talking, instead of the wall along those houses are actually fronting the street. There's some on the other side, the right side of the screen, that are more mature. The trees have grown up along there. The power lines, I understand, are in the process of being moved, and be able to do some trees there as well at some point. But there's also sidewalks on both sides. There's a mid-block crossing for pedestrians just off the screen, and the bike path is along there. So there's a shared use path. So you can start to pull that all together and really create this idea of complete streets in that kind of context in other places around the area. Really looking forward to collaborating with all of you as we move forward. And with that, I will turn it over to Jonathan.
Thank you, Wade. My name is Jonathan Paul. I'm the principal of New Urban Concepts. I've had the opportunity to work the last year with the city of Lake Wales. I've helped communities throughout Florida, from the Panhandle down to Miami Beach, and from St. Augustine to Sarasota, and everywhere between. And one of my guiding visions has always been the famous quote from Daniel Burnham: to make no little plans because they have no magic to stir men's souls. And really that's what the thought process was, both with the Lake Wales Connected Plan and the Lake Wales Mobility Plan, which built on that and sort of set the framework for the Envisioned process you're going through now. And so a lot of this information is available to the city. A lot of work's been done. As was There's an executive summary that's been prepared. We're not going to have time to go over all these projects, but there's a lot of planning that's been done in terms of the future transportation network to set the groundwork for the work that Wade and Victor and others are going to be doing to take it from the concept and the vision down into the reality of your community. And it's involving transportation, street trees, transit, and really laying out the vision for how residents and businesses and visitors of this community are going to get around for the next 20 years. If you really want to get into the detail, there's a 200-page document that lays out all the projects, the timeframes, a very detailed description, and all those little lines and maps and circles described in this report itself, and it is available from the city. But really how I envision this is it's a tool. Lake Wales is in a unique position right now. You have not been overrun by growth. I've been in Florida for 40 years now. I've lived all over the state. I work for various communities from Tampa and Orlando to, Bunnell up in the near Jacksonville area and some very rural areas. Right now I'm working in Indiantown, just south of here, very similar to Lake Wales. One thing that Indiantown and Lake Wales both have is a lot of high and dry land and not a whole lot of oak trees and a lot of citrus pastures. And that's really attracted to developers because a lot of places in Florida are wet. They have traffic problems, they're already overgrown. And so we took the approach in laying out this mobility plan. How do we set the stage for Lake Wales to accommodate reasonable growth that benefits your community, and that so you don't end up like so many other places in Florida. And really that's focused on moving people. Traditionally, Department of Transportation, Polk County, a lot of local governments in Florida have focused on moving cars. And how fast can you get from point A to point B in your car? The mobility plan really focuses on how do you move people, whether they elect to walk, bicycle, ride a golf cart, or drive a car. We don't envision that people are going to get out of their cars and not drive again, but there are a lot of other modes of travel that can be accommodated if people feel safe to do so. And one of the biggest factors, and Wade touched on this somewhat, is speed. The speed of travel. Somebody walking 1 mile, maybe a little bit quicker, up to 7 miles an hour, jogging or running. Electric bike, scooters, 15 miles an hour, golf cart, 15 miles an hour. Cars, they're all going 35 miles or above. And so really when you start looking at other modes of travel, speed becomes an important factor. And so part of the mobility plan is to sort of set the process for Lake Wales to evolve both its comprehensive plan and its zoning regulations to ensure that the communities that are built in the future don't look like some of the slides that you saw from Haines City and elsewhere in Florida with a bunch of disjointed, disconnected developments with a lot of driveways. Part of this also sets the stage for moving beyond traditional design of roadways and focusing on the speed limit. And for those of you who don't know, if you've ever driven on a road, roads are designed for the speed of travel, either how fast people are driving now or how fast they're going to project to drive. So if you see a sign that's posted 35 miles an hour, most likely that road's been designed for 45 or 50. So taking a very simple approach in the comprehensive plan and the mobility plan, it says, instead of doing that for how you want people to drive or how they are driving, why don't you design your streets for the speed limit you want them to actually drive at? So if you want them to drive 35 miles an hour or above, they go out on State Road 60, they go out on US 27. If you actually want them to drive at 15 or 20 miles an hour, then you design your road for that. Not 10 miles above, not 20 miles above, but you actually design it for people to go 15 miles an hour. And this really relates to your neighborhoods and your core downtown. And this mobility plan has put in place the tools to do just that. So Victor, Wade, other engineers, planners can be creative in terms of how they design their streets because they're not all having to design them for cars moving fast. And so what does this mean in reality? This could be State Road 60 or US 27 at some point in the future. This particular corridor happens to be US 98 up in Sandestin in the Panhandle. And the mobility plan laid out a multi-year vision over a 20-year period from how do you go from a 6-lane arterial with no median and 5-foot sidewalks to something in the future that could have dedicated lane for transit or golf cart, safe crossings, and a raised median. And it's really putting in place the tools to make this transition from moving cars towards moving people. In addition, this is being practiced elsewhere. This is a military trail in Palm Beach Gardens. Again, a 6-lane arterial, 5-foot sidewalk. The plan calls for the first phase to replace that sidewalk with a trail, then eventually replace the bike lanes with a lane that can accommodate golf carts, and then even into the future, as a slide that Victor showed you along State Road 60 infilling the Kmart site, maybe eventually you get to the point where you can actually take one of those lanes and make it for bicycles, make it for scooters, make it for actually some autonomous transit vehicles. All this is going to happen over time. It doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it's not going to happen tomorrow, but really laying out the vision for this. Within your core neighborhoods in your downtown area, the mobility plans also set the framework to go from really moving cars to, again, moving people. The picture to the left is San Marco Avenue in St. Augustine. Right now it's a 2-lane roadway with a lot of on-street parking and a lot of underutilized asphalt. The mobility plans itself calls for, and we're in discussions with DOT right now, taking up some of that on-street parking and actually making a dedicated lane for trolleys, for golf carts, for bicycles on that corridor without ever touching outside the right-of-way. That's just from the back of curb to the back of curb. Another corridor working with the MPO down in the city of Bradenton, US 41's a 4-lane undivided roadway. We're talking about it, transferring it to a 2-lane divided roadway with protected bicycle lanes. If you see some of these numbers down at the bottom, when you start focusing on moving people around the community, you're not necessarily taking away all the capacity of the roadway, but you're actually also encouraging other modes of travel as well. A lot of your neighborhood streets here do not have sidewalks. So this concept first came out in the St. Augustine and in Bradenton. It's being approached and used elsewhere, but it's reusing your existing 24-foot wide streets. If you don't have room for a sidewalk today, maybe you actually restripe part of it to put in an advisory bike lane, a shoulder, a place for pedestrians to walk, or on-street parking, and you accomplish that by also lowering the speed limit on the roadway. Some people refer to this as traffic calming. This actually goes a step beyond that into actually implementing some solutions that are possible. And the mobility plans set the stage for the city to do this. It's also set the stage to put down design manuals. A lot of the stuff that you see on the roadways today, a lot of the subdivisions that you see coming in, or you drive to Haines City, you drive to Davenport, elsewhere, you say, that looks horrible, I don't want that in our community. That's because, developers, they're designing to the minimum standards. So if you want them to design to the minimum standards, you keep your code as it is. If you actually want a community that you're proud of, a transportation system that you want to see in the future, you design it that way. One of the few things the legislature hasn't taken away from local government right now is your ability to have a comp plan and a land development code. And as long as you still have that, if you don't like what you're seeing in your community, change your code. You don't like the way streets are designed, change the design of the streets to get something that you actually want to see. The mobility plan allows the city to do that, and I believe that's really what Victor's moving forward with. And again, these are all some different types of innovative designs that you can do now by focusing more on how do you want people to travel, what speed do you want them to travel at, versus designing just for cars. And if you want new development to build nice roads with sidewalks and shared use paths, require it. Make it part of your design standards. And so we looked at, similarly to what's going on with Lake Wales Envisioned, we looked at both the city itself and all the way out to the urban service area or the utility service area in terms of laying out the mobility plan. And you see we brought in a lot of corridors from state roads, county roads, in addition to a number of city roads. For the most part, all the state level planning, county level planning is focused on Bartow, Lakeland, Winter Haven. The long-range transportation plan maybe has 5 or 6 projects within Lake Wales in it. You go up to Lakeland or to the North Four Corners, there's 75, 80, 100 projects. So we really weren't working with a whole lot other than the great work that Victor's done and the community's done as part of Lake Wales Connected. And originally we were just going to do Lake Wales Connected and maybe move a little bit more into implementing it. But as we started getting into the process, we realized what was needed was how do you make all the good work that's gone on Lake Wales Connected and bring that out to the overall city. And that's really what the mobility plan ended up focusing on, is how do you connect your downtown core with the remaining part of the city, focusing primarily on that term complete streets, getting people to move around other than just driving a vehicle. So we looked all the way down, essentially south of State Road 60, there weren't plans to do anything except do some beautification on US 27 and maybe some bike lanes on US 27 in the future or US 17. But there weren't any future plans for roadways, any future plans for connectivity, any future plans to ensure that new development as it comes in helps to build your grid network. And so that's really something that you have a chance to be involved with through this process, is to make sure that as development comes in, it doesn't just build a bunch of cul-de-sacs, but it actually helps build a gridded network as part of your overall community. The mobility plan also incorporates street tree plan that was done as part of Lake Wales Connected, and a longer-term vision for enhanced transit service within the community. All that work went into also ensuring that new development as it comes in pays to mitigate for its impact. And they're going to do that through what's known as a multimodal transportation impact fee. So in addition to paying the county's road impact fee, new development as it comes in has to pay a fee to offset their impact. And that's for the broader system. And then it's up to the city to make sure that through its comp plan and land development regulations, developers are building their internal network and helping to build part of this connectivity. Again, these are basically the area in the orange, the upper left, basically the city boundaries today. That's where that fee goes into effect. The greater green area is the municipal service area or the utility area. When annexation comes in, this map ensures that the annexed areas will also pay for their impact. The map in the corner basically shows where the city can spend those funds. And with that, that's a lot to go over, a lot of plans, a lot of detail, but it is available from the city, maybe on their website. If not, you can contact them, and there's a lot of good information out there. And with that, I'll turn it over to Victor.
Let's thank John for that. We are behind, but I thought it would be useful to pause right here and see where there's a burning question. Hold the broad generalizations and just ask a technical question. Pete?
Yeah, just as a point of conversation so everybody knows, complete streets means what? Did I get the word right? Complete streets, or that phrase correct?
Yeah, so Wade, why don't you take that one? The question was, complete streets means what?
Complete streets means providing facilities for people to move, whether by car, by transit, bus, by walking, by bike, by scooter, by electric bike, but being able to provide those facilities for people to be able to move however we would expect them to move where that street ends up being. And that can change based on where that street ends up being. We would expect all of those things in great numbers in a downtown. So we'd want to have facilities that people could do all of those things. Now, when I say facilities, because the speed in a downtown may be lower, we can probably mix some of those uses. We get into areas such as some of our more rural roads out here, or out in the area, in the utility service area, it may look different. So a bike facility may not be right on the road. We probably don't want it mixing with 40-mile-an-hour traffic or even higher speed traffic. So that bike and walking facility may be off the road in that location. But a complete street is really about looking at what modes may be missing from a street that we would expect to see given where that street is, and making sure that those that the facilities are there and accommodation is there for those users.
I'm not going to disagree with Wade, but I'm going to tell you that was engineer answer because there's a little bit more to it. A complete street is not just for moving cars back and forth, but it also makes a great address for whatever homes or businesses are next to it. So its mission is bigger than seeing, you know, how wide and fast we can make the car movement. Its mission is to make it a better place for whatever human activities are going on. And that might mean the 4th of July parade or the Saturday green market on your main street, just as much as it might mean a bike lane or something like that.
Yeah.
So complete streets is not one size fits all, Pete. Depends on where we are.
I was going to say, let's don't forget about other things like lighting or shade trees, because goodness knows we need more shade where we live.
We'll do one more, and then we'll jump into the next session. Yes, sir. What's your name?
You haven't said what you're doing. I'm Bruce Francis. You haven't said, so we can have a context of who are you doing the planning for? Demographics, population growth, right? Death rates, birth rates. We have no context to say what is what.
That's a terrific question. So I appreciate you asking it, because sometimes we jump right in and we forget that it's the beginning of the conversation for a lot. Thank you for that. So, so what's happening is the city paused its land use study planning process that it was doing in order to anticipate future annexations and water and sewer and so on, until we had a chance to step back and get with the community and talk about what the vision for it should be. So what we're doing today is just kickoff. But in April, in particular, April 14th through 20th, we're going to have a design process where a whole team of people will be working all week, and there will be a series of community events. And that's when we're going to start going through the numbers. What's the population growth projection? And which projection do we believe in? And what are the market pressures? What's economically supportable or not? And the birth rates and death rates and those kind of factors come in with those facts. So that's what we're going to do in April. And so today is just to get us started, to set a base and maybe a little inspiration. But we're going to get deep into the technicalities with everyone in April. In the meantime, as we gather information about what's being learned about existing conditions or trends, we'll be putting all that stuff on the LakeWalesEnvisioned.com website, so you can keep track by going there.